Good evening. Welcome to Friday Nights Live from the parish. My name is Corinne Ernie. I'm the Senior Curator of Arts Reach and Special Projects. And while the museum is still closed, we're very happy that we can connect with you every Friday night through these online programs. And I have seen that many of you have been tuning in, so thank you very much. And also thank you for all the generous contributions that you have made. I would also like to thank our sponsors who make these programs possible, our presenting sponsor, Bank of America, as well as Sandy and Stephen Pearlbinder. So tonight it is a distinct pleasure to speak to two special guests. One of them is Donna Marie Barnes. She is the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island, and David Rattray, who is the editor of the Easthampton Star. So welcome, David and Donna Marie. David and Donna Marie have started an amazing project called the Plain Sight Project, and it's basically unearthing Black history on the East End of Long Island. Before we dive into their project, I just wanted to explain how this project ties in with an exhibition that we're featuring at the parish this summer by the artist Tomasi Jackson. And Tomasi, I hope that you're listening tonight. So Tomasi is a multidisciplinary artist, mostly a painter, and she bases her work on research that she does on disenfranchisement of people of color, both historical and contemporary. So when we started talking about the parish project, Tomasi asked me what's going on the East End of Long Island with communities of color. And we invited her to come out pretty much exactly a year ago. And she met with community leaders from the Shinnecock Nation, from the Black communities, for example, Eastville Historical Society, as well as with members from the Latinx community. And so after the presentation of David and Donna Marie, I will show you some images to also give you a visual context of how Tomasi works and how she integrates images and ephemera from her research into her work. So, but now I would like to turn over the word to Donna Marie.
Thank you, Corinne. Good evening, and thank you to the Parish Art Museum for inviting us to speak about our work with the Plain Sight Project. The purpose of our project is to comprehensively identify enslaved persons and free Blacks from the 1600s to the mid-19th century, to locate and preserve burial grounds, habitations, and work sites in the Easthampton Main Street Historic District, at Sylvester Manor and Shelter Island, and in the greater East End area of Long Island. Our mission at the Plain Sight Project is to find and research the lives of the enslaved people, and most importantly, to say their names. And so this evening, to begin, we'd like to read to you from a 1698 Southampton and Southold list of inhabitants that they compiled in September of that year. And we'd like to read to you the names of the men and women on this list who are indicated as Negro slaves.
I'm going to read the names of the men. Will, John, Peter, Dick, Tom, Gooey, Jack, Dick, Caesar, Jethro, another Jack, Titus, Jeffrey, Lewis, Mingo, Dick, Titus, Tom, Will, Jack, Frank, Caesar, Samson, Jehu, Nero, George, Sambo, Ned, Toby, Peter, Sisto, and Bridget.
And the women from Southampton: Anne, Betty, Elizabeth, Perry, Abby, Sarah, Hannah, Joanne, Sarah, Betty, Hager, Betty, Hannah, Rachel, Judith, Ginny, Simony, Ruth, Dorothea, Simone, Peggy, Philia, Hitabel, Sarah, Rose, Marjorie, Hannah, Millie, Dinah, Bess, Mariah, Simone, and Isabel, who was the first Black child born on Shelter Island at Sylvester Manor.
And in Southold, the men: Mobsey, Titus, Sambo, Tom, Jack, Peter, Nagar, Santo, Tom, Bristol, and Cato.
Betty, Adria, Grace, Liddy, Simony, Rose, Peggy, and from Sylvester Manor, Tony and his daughters, Simony, Grace, and Abigail, John and his wife, Maria, and their daughter, Priscilla, and Hope, who was sister to Isabel and was the first Black child brought to Shelter Island from Barbados in 1651. These last 10 names that were on this list were also first listed on Nathaniel Sylvester's 1680 Last Will and Testament. They were grouped as family groups with their children bequeathed to the children of Nathaniel Sylvester. Pictured here is the 1737 Sylvester Manor house, which is the second house built on this site. The original house, built in 1651, was part of what was come to be known as a provisioning plantation that was run by Nathaniel Sylvester and a group of partners who owned several sugarcane plantations on the island of Barbados in the West Indies. The family groupings of the enslaved people of Sylvester Manor, other than their names, we know very little about them. Hannah and her husband, Jacaro, who were the parents of Hope and Isabel, were brought to Shelter Island from Barbados in 1653 and were the property of Nathaniel's 16-year-old bride, Grizzle Sylvester. We can only imagine, and at the Plainside Project, part of what we do, in addition covering the names, is to imagine the lives in this place that we live. And so for Hannah and Jacaro, we can imagine that as a young couple that were owned by an unexperienced young girl who had just come from London, what was it about her that made her attractive to be chosen to come to Shelter Island? Had she worked in a house? Did she have good domestic skills? Was she a cook? She was a young mother, so perhaps she had experience with childbirth and pregnancy. Grizzle Sylvester went on to have 11 children who lived into adulthood. Is Hannah responsible for that because of the care and the experience that she had in taking care of these children? Her daughters, Hope and Isabel, we know very little about, other than that they grew up alongside the Sylvester 11 children. You can go to the next slide. Her husband, Jacaro, probably worked the land. From archaeological artifacts that were found on the property, we have evidence of the work of women in the sewing needles and the pins and the thimbles. Next slide. And for the men, the cobblestone drive that was laid, along with clay pipes and musical instruments and nails and bricks. From all of this evidence that we find on the place, we can construct images and imaginings of what the lives of these individuals were. Next slide. Okay. In the landscape of Sylvester Manor, which today encompasses 235 acres and is run by the not-for-profit organization Sylvester Manor Educational Farm, there are physical reminders of the presence of the enslaved in the early years of the provisioning plantation, including this stone boulder wall, which extended at one time from one end of the property to the other, at the time when the property included the entire island of Shelter Island, which is 8,000 acres. This boulder wall is an immense achievement of engineering and construction, and has lasted over 400 years. And this, we can take evidence of what these lives were like in this place. Imagine, we're in a snowstorm right now, and the East End is covered and blanketed in snow, and we're all safe at home on our Zoom call. But in 1651, coming from the West Indies, what was life life like for these individuals? How did they survive? We have to ask simple questions like, what did they wear? How did they keep warm? How did they survive this? And the fact that they did survive it, but yet we don't know anything about them. We only have their names. Next slide. At Sylvester Manor, within this picket fence are buried 200 individuals. This area is known as the burying ground of the enslaved and indigenous people, the Afro-Indigenous burial ground. And the stone that was placed in front of it by the descendant family in 1884 reads, "The burying ground of the colored people of Sylvester Manor since 1651." Again, from archaeological findings and ground penetrating radar, we know that this is a burial ground and that, as I said, 200 people are buried here. Next slide. This etching is of a woman whose name is Julia Dyed Havens Johnson. Julia was a freeborn woman of color who was born on Shelter Island. Her mother, Dido, was enslaved to another Shelter Island family, and her father was an unnamed white man. Julia worked at Sylvester Manor in various jobs, from housekeeper to nurse, for over 3 generations. And she lived on land that she had inherited from her stepfather, whose name was Comus Fanning. This was originally an enslaved man who worked on Shelter Island and was enslaved to Phineas Fanning, who was a landowner in Southold. Comus was given his freedom. He was manumitted at the end of the American Revolution, and he went on to be able to buy 23 acres of prime land on Shelter Island, which he then left to Julia. Julia, throughout her life, sold off the land bit by bit. She was encouraged to do so by the descendants of the Sylvester family, and they paid her pennies on the dollar and brought back her prime property at far below market value. Julia is the last person that we know that was buried in the burying ground. She lived until about 1908. Also, during the end of the Revolution, when several of the patriotic families returned from exile, several of the enslaved people, including a woman named Matilda at Sylvester Manor, who had been left to tend to the house and to the farm and to the land, was given her freedom. She was manumitted in 1797. We first learn of Matilda from a census and from inventory that was done in 1767, which she's listed as property. She was manumitted and was then forced to borrow money from the family that enslaved her in order to build a house on the land that she rented from the family. In her freedom, she was indebted to them for the rest of her life, paying rent and paying back the loan. However, in the 1810 census, Matilda is listed as a free woman of color and the head of her household and a member of the Presbyterian Church. Memories of Matilda are not evident on the property. Her house no longer stands. We don't know where it was, but having her name on these census records listed as a free woman, when previous to her manumission, she was listed not by name, but simply a check on the page under enslaved females, is an empowering presence, and we honor her. Next slide. At Sylvester Manor, there was a permanent tribute to the women who were enslaved there on what we call the slave staircase. For an exhibition that I curated several years ago called The Women of the Manor, I had no images for the enslaved women. I only had their names, and so their names represent them here, placed on the stairs that they walked up and down, carrying food, laundry, chamber pots, and all other manners of service. Hopefully one day, all of you will be able to come and visit us when we can have visitors again inside the Manor House. But before that time, we do continue this work to uncover these names and to fill in some of the details of these lives. Thank you.
So
Thank you, Donna Marie. I just have a quick question, which actually came
Sure.
from the audience. Someone is asking, if Julia was freeborn, why does the caption under this image say
Oh,
that she was
yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that, because I forgot to say. That etching was from a magazine article that was done on Sylvester Manor. It was taken from a photograph. And if you can see in this slide, that photograph in the background is the image of Julia that the etching was made from. The etching erroneously, in the magazine erroneously captioned her as the last slave of Sylvester Manor, sort of a romanticized version of the truth, when in fact she was never enslaved. This photograph is the only image that we have of a person of color from Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island. So thank you so much for asking that question, because I did forget to say that.
Thank you.
So what you'll see on the next slide is a glimpse of sort of how we do our work and why we call this the Plain Sight Project. This is 1659, and this is straight out of the Southampton town records, which are scanned and available. You could read them tonight if you wanted. And this is a mind-blowing piece of information, because in the second line you see Peter the Negro, that he shall have 3 acres of land in some convenient place by Arthur Howell, his close at Mecox, provided that he, the said Peter, give up to the common that land he hath in use by Cobb's pound. So this is a mind-blowing sentence if you know what you're looking at and know to look. And what this means is there was a free black man living in Watermill at some point prior to February 20th, 1659. And the town of Southampton wanted the land for some purpose. And this is Cobb's Pond. So Cobb's Pound, this is just where the Watermill gets very narrow between Mecox and the Watermill Pond. Is somewhere in that little neck of land that's just west of that. So this is essentially maybe a hop, skip, and a jump from the Parish Art Museum. So Peter's living there and doing something on this land, presumably farming, in 1659, and then offered land down somewhere near where the Ludlow dairy cattle are today. So I know we throw a lot of dates at you, but think about this. This is 1659. Southampton was created by English colonists in 1640. 19 years later, you've got a free black man living in Watermill, involved in a land deal to move to Mecox. You know, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And why this is really important is, I think when we started the project, we knew of a handful of enslaved people. And the narrative was that the richest families on the East End, the Sylvesters, gardeners of Gardener's Island, were enslavers. And it turned out not to be the case. It turned out that there were free blacks. It turned out that basically any family of means was an enslaver. Could we go to the next slide, please? This is the back of the Mulford farm grounds in Easthampton, which are owned and managed by the Easthampton Historical Society. And when we looked at the records, we discovered is one of the sort of epicenters of enslavement here, going all the way back to its really first long-term inhabitant, was a guy named Josiah Hobart. And in 1711, his will directs how his Negro girl, once you jump to the next slide, we might be able to see her name in sort of the down there, sort of highlighted in the lower left. It says Negro girl named Flora. And he goes on to direct how she is to go to his heirs. And if someone dies, who then Flora goes to. Again, this is a document hiding in plain sight. It's sort of a cliche, but Flora. So we've had, we have an enslaved woman in 1711. Let me pop to the next slide, and then we could talk a little bit about sort of how this. It's a moment of epiphany. The church building on the left there is the 1717 Easthampton Church, which, among other things, had a substantial gallery of seats for the people of color, mostly enslaved Blacks who had joined the church. A guy named Ned was kind of the doorway to this entire project for me. He's buried in somewhere down in Easthampton, an area called Freetown. And I'd written a column in the newspaper. Oh, by the way, I run the Easthampton Star. I forget if we mentioned that before, but I wrote a column that we would never know anything more about Ned. And I got called out pretty directly by a local historian who said, no, actually, Ned is all over the town records. And in fact, Ned was hired over and over again, turns up in the Easthampton Town Trustee records, to ring the bell or sweep that church, which you're looking at there. But, this sort of, these sort of difficult to read records aren't the only place where we get information. The next slide, please, which shows the sort of north shore of Montauk. Obviously, this is after the end of enslavement here, end of slavery. But this is to illustrate the story of Venture Smith, who was born Brotier Furrow in about 1729 in West Africa and enslaved on Gardiner's Island when he was only about 8 years old. And when he was 22, Fisher's Island being part of Southold, right? And he left it, he later in life, he dictated an autobiography. So this is how we know this. In about 1650, when he was 22 years old, he and a couple of other enslaved people on the property decided to escape. And let me read very quickly from what he says. He says, "The place to which we designed to go was the Mississippi. Our next business was to lay in a sufficient store of provisions for our voyage. We privately collected out of our master's store 6 great old cheeses, 2 firkins of butter, and 1 whole batch of new bread. When we had gathered all our own clothes and some more, we took them all about midnight and went to the waterside. And we stole our master's boat, embarked, and then directed our course for the Mississippi River. We first steered our course from Montauk Point at the east end of Long Island. And after our arrival there, we landed, and Hetty and I made an incursion into the island after fresh water." So 1750, you have a what's called a slave narrative, because he was free at the time, a specific story about an enslaved man on Fisher's Island who makes an escape attempt, ends up in Montauk. One of his co-conspirators steals their clothing and runs in the direction of Easthampton, and eventually they catch up with him in Southampton and drag him back to Fisher's Island. They're hoping to get mercy or clemency from their enslaver. It's an amazing story, and perhaps more amazing is that none of us really knew about it. It was something that's not taught in the schools here. Could you pop to the next slide, please?
David,
Yes.
There is a question from the audience. Mark Antonio, hello. He's asking, did I hear correctly that even freed Black families of means owned slaves?
Not in this part of the world, although it's a very interesting thing, because Venture Smith eventually became a pretty wealthy landowner and was able to buy people, including his wife and children, and some men who are not related to him as well, essentially taking ownership and then freeing them. So no, people of means, it really is the way Donna Marie and I put it about people of means is basically, if you had a name, if you had a road named after you out here, odds are you were an enslaver. So, Arthur Howell, who else can we think of? Osborne's and Hedges, and
Buell,
Hunting, Buell. Yeah. So
Dayton's.
Yeah.
Any of the family kind of place names that you see on street signs driving through the East End of Long Island, they were enslavers.
Yeah.
And so now we think that every time you drive by them, you'll never think of them the same.
I think that's really.
Have you had contact with these families for your research?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what has the response been?
You know, it's really interesting. I initially approached it really with trepidation that they were going to fight back. One family that shall remain nameless actually challenged me pretty hard, to prove it, that they were going to, reserve judgment. But the Mulfords, who we mentioned before, talking about the Mulford farm, who still own property in Easthampton since 1650, still in the family. They come back every summer to visit family here. And I've been emailing with a member of that family, and it's, I'm being greeted with curiosity. They didn't know either. And frankly, I didn't know that my own family were enslavers on my father's side in Easthampton, going all the way back to, among other people, the Reverend Nathaniel Hunting. My great grandmother was a Hunting, who himself was an enslaver and a remarkable man. Hunting, just to sort of pause for a moment, wrote down the deaths and baptisms of everyone in Easthampton for a period of something like 40 years. And he did that for white and black alike. And so we have, for example, a story of an unnamed enslaved black boy drowning in a canoe in Georgia Pond on their way back from church, I believe it is. They got close to the shore and it flipped over. And that's just a remarkable image to think about. These I think it's 4 children, one of whom is enslaved, drowning in the pond. So we're on the Gardiner's Island slave quarters image here, which is interesting in that was really the sum total of slavery that I knew about growing up here. And before I got into this project, I knew that there were enslaved people on Gardiner's Island. But that's really all I knew. Was there another question? I saw something pop up that looked interesting.
Yeah, there are quite a few if you want me to read them.
Sure.
I think they're very relevant to this conversation. So someone's asking, does anyone have a sense of how many free blacks there were at the time?
Well, it's a 180-year span of time, so you have to pick. Right. But in Easthampton, there is a free black man in 1676 who's building a house, and they give him the use of the land. Of course, he can't. He can't sell it or give it away or leave it to his children. It has to revert to the town as it was before. So he could use the land. But, again, what is a free black man doing in Easthampton 1676? Where did he come from? Who was he? There were, as you get closer to the 19th century, there are more free blacks around. But Donna Marie, I would say for the most part, even as we begin to look at the early censuses, like the 1790 census, there really aren't too many free blacks.
I don't think we have a number yet. We do, again, from the census, we do have a handful of names. And at this point, it has been difficult to find their origins. For instance, on Shelter Island, there's a man named David Hempstead, whose son, who's also called David Hempstead, goes on to be a landowner and a leader of the Eastville community of Sag Harbor. And at this point, I don't know where David Hempstead Sr. came from, or whether he was born enslaved and was manumitted, whether he was freeborn. There's a lot that we just don't know. And as our project expands beyond Easthampton, Sag Harbor, and Shelter Island to encompass other towns and villages, and we gain access to new sources of records and archives, we hope that those names will possibly be repeated, or more explanation will be available, and we'll be able to broaden and expand the stories of the individuals who now we only have a name for.
One of the things about enslaved people is that because they were property, they had a tendency to turn up in wills and household inventories and other forms of transactions where free people at the lower ends of the economic ladder, whether they be English or Irish or West African, or even Native people, tend not to show up in records as often, because a lot of what we look at are commercial records. For example, in Easthampton, there's a series of several generations of shoemakers books that list, so and so's Negro Phyllis came and got a pair of shoes on such and such a date.
So that's really interesting how you got your research done, through these commercial records.
Yeah, they're incredibly
and
valuable.
Account books.
Yeah. Someone else is asking, speaking of street names, if there has been any effort to rename the streets after some of the enslaved people.
Well,
that's an interesting, that's an interesting and fun kind of question. It's something that we talk about ourselves a lot, and we're at a point in the project where when we tell these stories and do public events like this and present this information, we do not consider ourselves historians, because we're not. We both have backgrounds in journalism, and we are storytellers, and we are telling you the story of the lives of these people as best we can. Now that you have this information as the public, as the community, we're now asking the question of our audiences, now what do we do? Yeah. We've given you the information. We've uncovered that this is part of the history of this place that up until now we didn't know anything about, that we weren't taught in schools. A lot of times we hear a very simple statement of, I didn't know there was slavery in New York. I didn't know slavery was abolished in 1827. I didn't know there was slavery on Long Island, in Easthampton, in my village, that in my family. And so now that you have this information, we're starting to ask the public, what do we do about it? How do we move forward? How do we honor this history and these people? Do we rename the streets? So for instance, Buell Lane, do we rename it Dinah Buell Lane because Dinah was enslaved to Mr. Buell? Do we add their names to the street signs? Do we build a monument? That's not really our job, and that's not what we feel responsible to do. We are part of the community conversation. But at this point, in doing these presentations, we are opening up this conversation to involve everyone. And as we move forward, we have to make those decisions in each of our communities and towns and villages.
I think that one of the things that we do and maybe as effective as any renaming might be, is we encourage people to ask the question, who was in my community? Were they enslaved? Were they free? What did they do? And where did they go? And I have a friend who's in one of the Hudson River towns, and he was inspired by what we did. And he just went to his own local library and started reading wills. And within an hour or two's work, had found the names of a number of enslaved people. And at that moment, it's actually interesting, even asking the question of the sort of traditional history keepers, of librarians and historical societies, you can sense their eyes get a little bit wider, and you're kind of changing the conversation. You're kind of moving this along just by asking the question, who was here? And the fact is that a lot of people were. So in Easthampton, just to throw some more numbers at you, we have the names or confirmed identities of over 300 enslaved individuals. We read you nearly the names of 100 enslaved individuals from 1 year in the town of Southampton, where we've barely scratched the surface. There's a group working in Southold that have a couple hundred more. It is a guess, really, but we think we'll probably be able to get the names of maybe a third, maybe a half of the enslaved people. For example, if you were not baptized, you were not really going to end up and didn't die during the lifetime of Reverend Nathaniel Hunting, you weren't going to end up in his lists. So who knows what the total really was,
Mhm.
but we believe that by this summer we will have the names of 1,000 enslaved people in Southampton, Easthampton, Shelter Island, and Southold.
Have you contacted libraries and schools to include this project in teaching material, or archives that are available on the website?
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yes.
there's a couple of bits of outreach. It's actually wonderful. We did an Easthampton High School intern who made a 5-minute video for 7th graders and has been working on showing it to other middle school age groups here. And there appears to be in the works, I'm keeping my fingers crossed, a Southampton High School English class that, if I play my cards right, I would like them to dig deep into the list of enslaved people from 1698 and try and put together a little more information. Censuses are great to kind of confirm someone existed. They don't really tell you much. They don't tell you whose household they were enslaved in, what they did. They're not. There's not a lot of. It's weird. There's not a lot of data in a census. It's really just a kind of a check mark or a name. Right. It doesn't tell you much.
Yeah.
Someone's asking about the history of Black people in Sag Harbor.
Is that the question? What's the history of Black people?
What is the history of Black community in Sag Harbor?
Okay. There were enslaved people living in Sag Harbor. I'm a resident of Sag Harbor and have been for all of my life. I live in the African American historic community of Nineveh. So yes, there were enslaved people in Sag Harbor. Due to COVID, we have not yet been able to get into the archives at the John Germain Library in Sag Harbor or the Historical Society. So that information, the detail of that information is yet to come. But however, there is a community in Sag Harbor that we refer to, and it's called Eastville. And traditionally and historically, Eastville was always a community of 3 cultures: freed people of color, Native Americans, and European immigrants. And these 3 cultures lived together in these streets of Eastville and in these homes. They were homeowners. And so in the early, I'd say 1830s, free Blacks were starting to rent property in Eastville. Some of the men went to sea as whalers. Their wives were domestics, seamstresses, and this community grew up. So, but as far as the enslaved population, like as I said, we've yet to really just get into those records, and due to COVID, that timetable was sort of put off.
Right, and someone's asking if the student who found out or if you have checked in with students if they found out if their family owned slaves.
That's a good one. I don't know that we've encountered specific students.
Right.
That's actually a good. It's I don't know how the public schools would feel about us sort of charging in to do that. I think it would be great. We ought to try though. It's interesting though, Donna Marie. In some ways, we've really focused on very strongly on the enslaved and not the enslavers. Exactly. When we tell these stories, we try not to lead with the white enslavers. Focus on the names, the individual enslaved. It's a different way to look at history. But the key thing is really it's about work and creating communities. Exactly. And creating communities that ultimately were the building blocks of the United States. It's colonial outposts that became incorporated towns within the colonies that became states and, threw off the yoke of British imperialism. So our thing is to place these individuals, enslaved men and women, children, back into American history as it's known in a popular sense, and that the blood, sweat, and tears of these individuals. We have a Cato, for example, who I believe may have been involved in carting crops to the port at Sag Harbor, because he got so many shoes in those shoe books, those transaction books. He has 6 pairs of shoes in a year. His enslaver was a substantial farmer,
Right.
shipping flax and things like that. But I think you can tell by the way we speak, we are not focused so much on the enslavers, although that's interesting. But the labor of the enslaved and how that's part of the American story that's just not being told.
So maybe we can continue with your slides, David.
Oh yeah, we should just pop ahead. I think I have 2
Yeah.
more. And what this is about is really as slavery is winding down, this is a statement that I can barely read it. Simeon Rugg is a enslaved man whose mother was enslaved to Abraham Osborne Jr. And this essentially is Simeon's enslavement papers. As gradual emancipation was being put into place in New York, when you were born was incredibly important, because there was a formula by which your freedom depended on where you were born, and if you were born free. In this case, Simeon's mother, because she was enslaved, meant that Simeon was also the property of Abraham Osborne. And we pop to the next slide. And one of the things that we're asked a lot is where did they go? And that's really a fascinating thing. We have some little bits of information. There's a guy named London Dayton in Easthampton who sort of moves upstate, owns some property, sells the property, comes back, may have been living in New York at some time. But it's not clear where they went. That's a whole other level of investigation. But one thing's very clear, that with fairly limited exceptions, there really was no land available for free Blacks. And they were essentially turned loose in their own recognizance, that they were their former enslavers had to sign pieces of paper that that they were able to fend for themselves. They were basically cut loose. Some cases they were left money. I know there are some examples where enslaved people are freed and then left money in wills, but for the most part, they fended for themselves. And I think generally there is a sense that many of them migrated towards cities in the North. But it's incredibly treacherous, because there's a free Black. You could be recaptured, and many were, and essentially marched to the cotton world in the South, where slavery was still practiced. There was importation of captive Africans had been prohibited, and so there was a huge market for recapturing freed people. So it's a treacherous existence. But I think for us, one of our dreams is to be able to find some of these descendants. Yeah.
Yes. So at Sylvester Manor, it's a slightly different situation, because the manor property, which now totals 243 acres, was owned by the same family for 12 generations, up until the creation of the not-for-profit organization in 2009. And so the records and the listings are all still there, basically. And from account books of the 19th century post-emancipation, so post-1827, there are records of free Black people who work at the property and that get listed by name. Joe, Negro boy, paid 50 cents to cut firewood, or Violet, Negro woman, who did some washing and was paid in cider. After a while, say about just before the Civil War, so the late 1850s, those names start to fall away. And again, we don't know where they went, whether some of them did move to Sag Harbor, whether they moved to the city or to the North Shore. Primarily, we think it was done because of the lack of work, the lack of opportunity, the lack of land to buy. And so that's the part of the story that we're yet to get to. There's always so much work to do. Corinne, are there more questions before we go to your part about Tomashi's work?
There are quite a few questions. I think maybe we'll answer one or two and then we'll move on to Tomashi's part. There's one question that someone asking, have you been able to determine to what extent slaves on the East End were treated cruelly? Was it similar to other enslavers like down south?
That's a complicated question on many levels. And the simple answer is no, we have not learned of specific incidences, although there are a few that are cruel. But the very nature of the fact that we're talking about people whose freedom was prohibited, whose movements were restricted, who were enslaved and basically imprisoned. And so whatever other attributes we put on that is the basic fact. And that's the point that we're starting from. These are people that were not acknowledged, that we knew nothing about, because they were enslaved and imprisoned in the places where they were kept. And so to compare it to the history of enslavement in the South, it was a different circumstance. This is not as large an agrarian area, so there were no large scale farms and plantations. Slaveholders did not own large number of enslaved people. It may be one or two to maybe four in a household, but the fact that it was prevalent throughout almost every household of means throughout the region makes it significant.
Well,
and so for us, it's not really a question of was it better than in on a cotton plantation. The simple fact that these people were held in bondage.
Well, and that's right. And the jumping back to Venture Smith, he was subjected to beatings and all sorts of physical violence, but probably the hardest blow was about a year after his escape attempt. He was sold and had to be separated from his wife and first daughter, who was his only child at that point, who was just a month old. And I think it's hard to quantify physical violence and the pain of family separation. But in the North, family separation was very much the norm because these smallholders were not going to keep more than a few enslaved people in their homes or on their properties. But there's examples of extraordinary violence in Boston in the early mid 17th century. There is a myth that the North treated their slaves more kindly. I don't think there's any evidence of that. And I think that any of them in the North would have exchanged their lot to be free. They would want to be free.
Right. Thank you so much, David and Donna Marie. There's a lot more questions, and maybe we can address a few more later. But I would like to move on to Tomashi's project and how it, and I think it will become quite clear how her work connects to the work that you do as we talk about the work she does. And maybe you can also look at the chat meanwhile and the Q&A and see if there are any questions that pop out that you would want to answer. So Tomasi Jackson will do an exhibition at the parish called The Land Claim. So you see the connection right there, you know, the importance of land and land ownership. The show will open in July and run through October. Can we go to the next slide? So this is Tomasi in her studio. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to talk about three particular projects that Tomasi has done in the past couple of years. This project is about voter suppression in Ohio's Black communities. And this was a show that she did at the Wexner Center in Ohio just before the elections. And so you will see how questions of democratic rights are very important to Tomasi. Let's go to the next slide. This is a large-scale painting. As you can see, it consists of different materials. And what I really want to show here is how Tomasi integrates archival photographs into her work. So here you see photographs in the blue. These are people waiting in line to vote. And they're juxtaposed by a photograph of Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act. And that particular photograph of Johnson is printed on plastic strips. These are mylar strips that are hung in front of the canvas. And so they create this interaction of these two colors, the red and blue. Obviously, that's also on purpose. Tomasi also relies a lot on Joseph Alber's color theory and the idea of relativity in color and how we talk about color both in the arts and in society. So that's a very important component in Tomasi's work. Let's go to the next slide. This is, again, the similar concept where she juxtaposes historical photographs with more recent photographs in a work of art. Next one. This was a project for an exhibition she did at the Night Gallery in Los Angeles last year. And that's where she sort of investigates the origins and contradictions of American democracy. And that was following a artist residency she did in Greece, in Athens. So basically the birthplace of democracy, so to speak. And she really started to investigate the structures and mechanisms of American democracy. Let's go to the next slide. So as a part of that, she also looked at the crack epidemic in America and how it affected communities of color. In this painting, she juxtaposes two photos of drug addicts with photographs of her two sisters, which was taken by her mother. So you see also how her personal history intersects a lot with the history of the community of communities of color. And she also often integrates other materials in her work. For example, she has been using Pentelic marble dust from Greece. This kind of dust is used to restore the sacred monuments in Greece for monuments that represent democracy, and after which the monuments representing democracy in America have been shaped after. So she gets very literal with the material and integrates certain materials that are important to the stories that she wants to tell. Actually, in the previous images, she had also integrated soil from an underground railroad in Ohio. Let's go to the next one. In this work, it's called Ecology of Fear. She juxtaposes an image again of Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act with an image of the Freedom Riders bus that was bombed by the KKK. So again, you have a painted image in the background and then printed photography on these plastic mylar strips that are sort of covering the canvas, and again creating that interaction of color, of history in this work. Let's go to the next one. So this is an interesting project that will resonate with both of you. This is about the historic and contemporary housing displacement in New York City. That was a project that she presented at Tilton Gallery and at the Whitney Biennial in 2019. Let's go to the next slide. So Tomasi heard of a story that was breaking about dezoning homeowners of color in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods, for example, in Brooklyn. And she found out that there was this very shady government program called the Third Party Transfer Program, which had existed for a long time and basically restored distressed property and make them available, to people in the community. But they had to evolve into this sort of shell nonprofit organization, which ultimately sold these properties that they took away from mostly Black and brown homeowners and gave them to developers. And the basis of these, these transgressions were often like the claim that they didn't pay water bills or they didn't pay their taxes, which in most cases was actually not true. So Tomasi talked to the journalist, and she got a lot of photographs from these stories, and she juxtaposed it with a historical fact about the Seneca Village, which was a free Black community where Central Park is nowadays. And again, the city claimed that this was a distressed neighborhood and used that reason so they could level it and build Central Park. So Tomasi talked to a lot of historians, a lot of archivists and journalists, and gathered these photo materials to juxtapose homeowners from Seneca Village with homeowners from Brooklyn. So here you see Mary Lyons, who was from Seneca Village, with Yudi Ventura, who was a homeowner in Brooklyn, fighting to get her property back. Let's go to the next and last image. This is actually a print where, as the title says, make two Black property owners look like one. So here she's using two different types of red for the print. On the left side, you see Mr. Lyons from Seneca Village, and on the right side, Mr. Dorsey, Black property owner from Brooklyn. So I wanted to show these images of Tomasi's work so that you have a visual context of what to expect this summer at the parish when Tomasi will create new work based on her research from talking to historians and community members from the Shinnecock Nation, from Black communities, as well as the Latinx communities. And she's right now conducting a lot of interviews. They will be transcribed. We're also going to build an archive where all of that material will become available. And I know she's really very much looking forward to talking to both of you, David and Donna Marie.
Well, thank you. And we look forward to that. And I think that's, as we had said, that the beginnings of this project, the work that we have done in these last few years on it, and the information that we've uncovered and that we present to the public, I now see this as this body of work that we have done now being reinterpreted in different ways, either by artists, by communities talking about it, by schools who are going to incorporate it into the curriculum, and as well as for David and I, who, in this next phase of our involvement with the project, and how it isn't impacting us, both individually and both actually creatively, from David working on a book to my interpreting the information that the research that we're uncovering in photographs at Sylvester Manor. I think that's the impact, and that's the next step. So we look forward to speaking with Tomasi and seeing how we contribute to her project.
That's wonderful. Were there any questions that you would like to answer at this point? We have a few more minutes before.
There was one that I thought was really great, which is, do white people challenge the use of the term enslavers for these families? I've seen white people in other contexts resist this term. Yes. I had a kind of wild email exchange with a friend who is, shall remain nameless, who really took me to task for that. But it comes from two directions from my mind. And one is, I don't want to use, and maybe you noticed during this presentation, I don't like using the word slave because that's not what someone is. They are enslaved. So if you call someone a slave holder or slave owner, you are saying that the person is a slave. And the other piece of this for me is that enslavement is not a state of being. It's an actual, it's an act. It's every day that you keep someone enslaved, you are enslaving them. You are an enslaver. Every day that you are not making them free, every day that you're profiting from their labor and not giving anything back, you are as culpable as the traders, the Rhode Island families that funded more than 900 slaving voyages to the Americas. Donna Marie, do you see it that way?
No, I think you're absolutely right, and we often say that language matters, and because we are working to uncover these names, to give these individuals personhood, to give them agency, to learn of their lives, we cannot reduce them to the simple term of slave, because as David said, a slave does not include their personhood. They were enslaved. Slavery is not, a state of being. It doesn't identify that person. We're trying to uncover who they were as people, because we want you to see them by their name. We want Ned to be a man who lived in Easthampton, not a slave. That's an almost anonymous entity.
Slavery was complicated. Even while he was enslaved, Ned was making money, as did Venture Smith. I mean, Venture Smith bought his own freedom with money he made on the side fishing and cutting wood. He would fish at night to make money to buy his own freedom and then buy his family's freedom.
So it's actually not very complicated. And those are the terms that we use. And those are the terms that are used more and more by historians and historical institutions.
And I think that's why it's so important that you tell their stories. You unearth real people's stories, like everybody else's history, and you complete the history of this area by unearthing these stories, these people.
Absolutely.
It's an American story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
Any final words before we say goodbye? And actually, I would like you to leave an email address on the chat.
Yes, we did. And they're both available in the chat as well as the website for Plainside Project.
Yeah, we had a question that I won't get into the answer so much, but it was about the 5 families of Orient. And we have really dipped our toes. Some great work is being done up there. And so, yes, the Youngs family were enslavers, the Albertsons. But, I can provide more detail if I'm emailed and put you together with people who know the specifics. The other thing, which I don't know if we've talked about really, is how much we depend on volunteers. And we, even in hours help, reading old documents or transcribing documents can sort of move the story ahead. So I would encourage any of you who are interested to consider helping find people. Really, we're finding people.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
And as we uncover more stories, we will continue to do events and presentations, and hopefully this summer we will be able to meet in person and expand what we know and to be able to share it with the community. So thank you again, Corinne and the Parish Art Museum, for having us.
And thank you, Donna Marie and David, so much for this really important work and for joining us tonight.
Thank you. And to everyone who tuned in and asked these amazing questions. It's super invigorating for us to feel like we're reaching people. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Oops.